Hi, everybody. Welcome to Contemporary Art History. I'm your instructor, Jacqueline Gleisner, and today we are going to look at post-war European art, focusing on the first half of Chapter 17 of the course textbook. It's important to stress how different the experiences of European artists were from their American counterparts at this time. American artists were able to retain a sense of aesthetic distance from the effects of World War II, but many European cities, such as London, Warsaw, Stalingrad, Berlin, and Rome, were destroyed or severely damaged. You can get a sense of the scope of the devastation from this image of London after the German Blitz, which took place on December 29, 1940. By the time World War II ended in 1945, tens of millions of people had been killed in the war, including 6 million Jews and other groups that were subject to systematic genocide, including homosexual men, disabled adults and children, and the Roma people. This aerial image shows the ruins of Warsaw in January 1945 after the deliberate destruction of the city by the occupying German forces. So great was the loss of life that traditional themes, techniques, and media were abandoned by European artists. They were deeply critical of anything that could be associated with the conditions of life that existed before the war. This strident reaction to World War II departs from the ways that artists responded to the First World War. After World War I, progressive Europeans sought reason, and the pursuit of pure rationalism in art and architecture can be seen in De Stijl and the Bauhaus. Yet, after World War II, reason was abandoned for existentialism, prompting a skepticism towards existing conventions for visual artists. Again, no rules or preconditions preceded the artworks. After World War I, the theater of the absurd was a movement in dramatic literature and performance which aimed to overturn or reject traditional themes, techniques, and media. And as I mentioned, existentialism also emerged as a way to purge all pre-existing conventions. In other words, there were no longer any rules or conventions necessary to produce art. Anything went. Or as the French philosopher Paul Sartre put it, there are no aesthetic values a priori, but there are values which will appear in due course. In post-World War II Europe, artists were working in a range of styles, and today we will look at examples of both figuration and abstraction across the region. We are starting with post-war figuration, and chief among the figurative artists was Pablo Picasso. We've already seen his iconoclastic work, Demoiselles d'Avignon, in this course. Through this work and many others, Picasso was continuing a dialogue with other artists from the past. In 1937, Picasso painted Guernica in response to the Nazi bombing of a small town in Spain. The town was of no military value, and the bombing of Guernica during the Spanish Civil War stoked fears across Europe about a steep rise in casualties during future conflicts. The twisted figures, the massive scale, and the black and white color palette contribute to the overwhelming sense of anguish that this work conveys. In the Charnel House from 1945, Picasso again uses the grisaille palette and twisted figuration of Guernica. In the center of the composition are a mass of bodies. They are a murdered family sprawled beneath a dining table, and some have argued that this jumbled mass of corpses recalls the heaps of dead bodies that were discovered in Nazi concentration camps upon liberation. While Guernica marked the very violent beginning of World War II, the Charnel House shows the destitution of the end of the war. The composition of Picasso's painting recalls Daumier's print Rue Transnonaine, seen here. Daumier's print was a brutal depiction of an actual event that took place in Paris in 1834. Another key artist working within a figurative vein was Alberto Giacometti. Giacometti was Surrealism's most important sculptor, but in 1934 he broke with the Surrealists and began making works that were stylistically very different. In this early work, you can see the influence of biomorphic forms, a common identifier among Surrealist practitioners, as we have discussed. Later, in The Head of Man from 1947, Giacometti depicts a human head on a rod with the mouth agape, an image of violence and anguish. The textured surface of this work recalls the grittiness of earlier works. It also may draw connections to lacerations of the skin or a rugged landscape. Art critic Dory Ashton said in 1948 that there was, quote, an unmistakable existentialist milieu of his work, end quote. Chariot from 1950 suggests an Etruscan bronze with its soft patina. Giacometti had developed an interest in the surfaces of his works earlier on in his career. Similar to other works, this sculpture has a sense of isolation and an eeriness to it with the strong elongation of the solitary figure. Giacometti described how the heft of his figures changed, stating, I began to work from memory, but wanting to create from memory what I had seen, to my terror, the sculptures became smaller. They had a likeness only when they were small, yet their dimensions revolted me, and I tirelessly began again, only to end several months later at the same point. A large figure to me seemed false, and a small one equally unbearable. And then often they became so tiny that with one touch of my knife they disappeared into dust. But the head and the figures seemed to me to have a bit of truth only when small. All this changed in 1945 through drawing. This led me to want to make larger figures, but then to my surprise, they achieved a likeness only when tall and slender. We see this emphasis on slender figures again in this work called The Forest, but notice the large, foreboding head in the background. Jean-Paul Sartre described one of Giacometti's sculptures, writing, emptiness filters through everywhere. Each creature secretes his own void. Yet despite Sartre's seemingly apt descriptions of Giacometti's work, Giacometti rejected the existentialist interpretations of his output. Next up is the French artist Germaine Richier. Richier received her training from students of Rodin, and her early sculptures emulate this tradition. Early on, she was making portraits and busts. Praying Mantis from 1949 depicts a strangely humanoid creature. The Surrealists saw this insect as a metaphor for threatening femininity, and Richier treats this subject as a totem of survival. Hurricane Woman is a wounded but heroic figure. There are lacerations on the surface, but the stance of the figure is very solid and stable. Richier experimented with techniques and surfaces, choosing to emphasize emotional experiences and memories. Her surfaces are often imperfect because she would press organic objects into the molds. Balthazar Klosowski, Count Tyrola, was also known as Baltus, a childhood nickname, and he was a figurative painter in post-war Europe as well. Balthus was born into a distinguished Polish family. He was friends with Giacometti and the poet Rainier Maria Rilke. He settled in Paris in 1924 and copied the old master paintings in the Louvre, but did not receive any formal training as an artist. Balthus was intrigued by the sexual nature of dreams, but he was not really a part of the Surrealists officially. From the 1930s onward, most of his paintings contain some element of sexual charge, often with prepubescent girls, as you see in this painting titled The Golden Days. Unlike Balthus, French artist Jean Dubuffet had some academic training. He studied briefly in Paris at Académie Julian. He also studied experimental languages and was particularly inspired by the 1922 text Artistry of the Mentally Ill by Dr. Hans Prinzhorn. Dubuffet found a brutal and honest expression in these works that felt more true to him than the works he found in museums at that time. He also greatly admired Paul Klee, who used the works of untrained artists as inspiration. This work by Dubuffet, called View of Paris, The Life of Pleasure from 1944, appears to be quite naive. After 1944, Dubuffet was quite prolific. The Corps de Dame series has a relationship with de Kooning's Woman series, but whereas de Kooning interrogates the female form, Dubuffet's painting has severed the relationship between beauty and female form. You can see that he was obsessed with art brut. He adored works by untrained artists. This work, called The Soul of Moran, created in May of 1945, also shows evidence of his interest in works by artists who were untrained. During the 1950s, Dubuffet worked with the theme of landscape, with representations of the soil and earth itself. Texturalities was a series of completely abstract works. Finally, this quote by Dubuffet sums up his beliefs as an artist. What I expect from any work of art is that it violates my customary valuations of things and offers me other unexpected ones. We're going to switch gears now and talk about post-war abstraction in France. Art informel roughly translates to formless art. The term came from Michel Tapier, the French critic, and originated with the idea of formlessness and its connection to abstraction. There are two other terms you should know. Art autre, also coined by Tapier, means another art, and tachism, derived from the French word tache, meaning stain or blot, refers to the European version of gestural painting. This is Nude from 1960 by the French artist Jean Fautrier, the leading pioneer of art informel. Painted in a representational style in the 1920s and 30s, Fautrier painted in a representational style in the 1920s and 1930s, but after the war, he started working on a series of hostage paintings, which often contained built-up masses of paint centralized on a background. Next, he worked on a series of torso paintings. This painting, however, won Fautrier the grand prize at the Venice Biennale that year. This is painting by Bram van Velde. He was Dutch by birth, but he lived most of his life in France, where he was good friends with the Irish playwright Samuel Beckett. Most of his compositions involve loosely delineated forms that recall works of the fellow Dutchman Willem de Kooning. Born in Germany, Hans Hartung fled Nazi oppression and landed in France. And like many other artists we've touched on during this course, many of his early works are influenced by surrealism. But by the 1940s, his mature style featured brisk, graphic structures of bold slashes, usually in heavy black paint, against numerous washes of luminous color. After he saw the works of Franz Kline, his works shifted in that direction. Sometimes it appears as though a figure or something might emerge from the painting if the correct viewing distance is achieved. This painting by Pierre Soulages feels akin to Hartung's works. Soulages went to Paris in 1938 and he settled there in 1946. His signature style involves abstractions based on tree structures with closely keyed color ranges. According to Soulages, the more limited the means, the more powerful the expression. The heavy impasto paint application was applied with a knife or very large brushes to achieve the desired effect. Born in Berlin as Alfred Otto Wolfgang Schultz, Wohls was raised in Dresden, and he moved to Paris in 1932 at age 19. He was detained at one point because he was born in Germany, and during the war he made paintings like Bird from 1949 seen here. This painting was based on his interest in biological specimens and anthropology. Sadly, Wohls drank heavily, and he died early at the age of 38. Next is Georges Mathieu, an outgoing artist who occasionally painted in front of an audience. He dressed in armor and attacked the canvas as viewers watched. All theatrics aside, Mathieu insisted he was a traditional painter who was working in a new abstract style called art informel. His style was calligraphic, yet the lines were created with sweeping paint that came directly from the tube, as you can see from this painting from 1953. Blue Night from 1953 by Jean-Paul Riopel shares some aesthetic similarities with the heavy paint applications of Mathieu. Here we see a mosaic of hues applied directly from paint tubes, which were then shaped with palette knives. Born in Montreal, Riopel settled in Paris in 1947. And as an aside, between 1955 and 1979, Riopel was the companion of the second-generation abstract expressionist painter, Joan Mitchell, whose painting Ici is seen here. The paintings of Maria Elena Vieira da Silva fall within the broad category of post-war abstraction, but her paintings are a bit challenging to categorize. Some paintings depict deep architectural spaces or interiors, and by the 1950s, her paintings became less representational and more abstract. The Invisible Stroller from 1951 is related to Picasso's analytic cubist style with its tonal color palette and sharp planes. Later, her paintings became more reliant on the grid, and they also became much flatter. Born an aristocrat in Russia, de Stael was forced to flee during the Bolshevik Revolution. He and his siblings were orphaned and grew up in Belgium, where they attended the Royal Academy of Fine Arts before moving to Paris in 1938. Around 1949, he began to work with palette knives, as you see in this painting from 1951. Later on, in 1953, he traveled to Sicily and was inspired by the quality of light there, the warmth of which is emulated in this painting from 1954. The following year, in 1955, de Stael jumped to his death from the terrace of his studio. We're going to close this lecture by discussing concrete art, which, as you will see, is quite the opposite end of the spectrum from the loose and sometimes heavy-handed artists associated with art informel. According to Theo van Doesburg, the painting should be constructed entirely from pure plastic elements, that is to say, planes and colors. A pictorial element has no other significance than itself, and consequently, the painting possesses no other significance than itself. From this quote, we glean a sense of the order and rigidity involved with concrete art. Max Bill is one of two artists associated with concrete art that we'll look at in this lecture. In the 1920s, he started making non-objective works, and by 1936, he called his works concrete. He studied at the Dessau Bauhaus from 1927 to 1929, where he met Joseph Albers. He was associated with abstraction creation in Paris and organized shows of concrete art in his native Switzerland. Bill insisted that painting and sculpture have always had mathematical bases, and he was fascinated with the helix spiral within sculpture especially. Systematically, he experimented with color and particularly the interaction of colors, as we see in this painting titled 9 Fields Divided by Means of 2 Colors. Whereas Mondrian's approach was painterly and intuitive, Bill's approach to his paintings was rooted in geometry and pristine forms. He said, concrete painting eliminates all naturalistic representation. It avails itself exclusively of the fundamental elements of painting, the color and form of the surface. Its essence is, then, the complete emancipation of every natural model, pure creation. And finally, we'll look at one example of concrete art by Richard Paul Losa. Losa's approach was similar to Max Bill's. Mathematics was at the core of his work, and he sought out the simplest units, such as small color squares. His compositions were predetermined, but his works conveyed a lyric feeling derived from the endless combinations of colors. Losa was an important influence of the op artist, an art movement that we will look at later on in this course. Thank you all for watching this lecture today. See you soon.